Hi, welcome or welcome back. If you are new here, my name is Tiffany. I am a secondary history teacher taking a small break this school year since we just moved across the country, and a professor in a teacher education department. My research interests fall into women's representation, secondary history curricula, women's history as a historian, and also legal history now as I'm finishing up a degree at present and looking at where women's history and legal history, specifically constitutional history, intersect. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about some women historians that I love. I am actually going to be dividing this book topic into 4 different videos to make it a little bit more digestible. So this first one, I am talking about women historians. In the second video, I'll be talking about books that focus on women's history. So these may or may not be written by women historians or historians at all. They could be written by literature scholars, philosophy scholars, American studies, or legal scholars. In the third video, I'm going to talk about some women represented in fiction. So historical fiction that could either be written by women or just center women in the narrative. And the final 4th video will be for teachers. And I'm going to share some books about women's history that I think should be on your classroom bookshelf. All right, again, this first one, I am talking about women historians. And so let's get into it. I cannot start this video without mentioning Anna Komnene, the first known named woman historian. This is the Alexiad, and this is about Anna Komnene's father. She was a princess in the Byzantine Empire, and she again tells the story of her father's rule, and embedded within this is the history of the Crusades. So for those of you that teach ancient world history, this probably comes, or pre-modern history, it probably comes up in your course. So pulling some excerpts from this might be a really fun way to get more women into your course and to mention the first female historian. She's pretty critical of the Crusaders in this. Some historians have looked at this and other scholars and said that she's biased because she is telling the story of the empire that she was a part of, as well as her own father. But interestingly, she does embarrass him and tell some not so flattering stories in a few places throughout the text. So while there's certainly some bias, and I think that's important to remember with any research you're looking at, whether coming from a historian or a social science scholar, etc., I think it's really important to remember how identity and positionality play into the research question being asked, the sources being gathered, and then how it is presented. So yes, of course, we want to keep that in mind, but I do like to point out, there's one story in there about her father running away from a battle and losing a very important holy relic. So not all flattering. The language and biases of the time are reflected in this, but if you haven't explored the Alexiad, I highly recommend. Beyond that first text, these don't really These don't really go in any specific order, although this next historian I am quite biased about because she is one of my all-time favorites. It is historian Catherine Kish Scholar. She is the preeminent scholar on Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley is one of my favorite women in history, in American history. I have done some work on her myself. If you're interested, I do have one video on my channel about her right now. It's not just about her, it's about the conflict around the first Equal Rights Amendment, which I'll talk more about in a little bit actually. But Florence Kelley, phenomenal 19th century labor history, women's rights, as well as a legal scholar. She was pretty phenomenal all around. This is a comprehensive biography on Florence Kelley. It's called Florence Kelley and the Nation's Work, and it is such a readable but highly detailed and well-researched biography. Catherine Kish Scholar, I look up to her so much for that biography, but really for this collection of letters from Florence Kelley. It is just the way she annotated every single one of these letters to provide such rich detail about who this letter was from, what the context of maybe the response to that letter or the previous letter that Kelley was responding to might have said, details about court cases and laws and other people that were surrounding this event. Like, so much. I learned about Josephine Goldmark primarily through some footnotes that I encountered here. And Josephine Goldmark was Louise Brandeis's, I believe, sister-in-law, but she was very instrumental in working with Florence Kelley and then helping Louise Brandeis develop the Brandeis Brief. Really phenomenal work that expands far beyond just Florence Kelley and into just showing her acumen as a historian and a scholar. She is one of my biggest inspirations for what it looks like to write quality history. Another historian, woman historian, who has heavily influenced my work is Kate Masser, and specifically her work Until Justice Be Done. She's a historian, a professor at Northwestern, and just absolutely phenomenal. And in this work, she is adding to the conversation about constitutional rights consciousness of everyday people, which stems back to Hartog's 1987 call for increased work on how the ideas of citizenship and personhood, specific in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, but just kind of the Reconstruction Amendments generally, how the average person, and especially those marginalized voices, contributed to the development of those ideas in the decades leading up to those amendments actually being written and then ratified. And Kate Masser lays this out so wonderfully. She really focuses on political abolitionists and says that they were central to the development of citizenship and personhood as a concept. She really spends a lot of the early sections of the book looking at movement abolitionists to push back against things like the Fugitive Slave Act. She goes beyond the obvious figures around amendment and constitutional legal history, and she really focuses on how writers and speakers and other people were making moves to develop this common language and ideology and push it into the political and legal arenas. So absolutely adore, highly recommend. It's very readable. I don't read history books, and this is something for another video. I don't read them from like beginning to end. I really dissect them. Like usually I'm going to the end of a section, breaking down what they say their argument is, and then going back and really dissecting and looking for those key arguments and sources. But this one, it's absolutely readable from beginning to end if that's how you choose to approach it. Kind of sticking with the theme, intentionally or no, again, I just pulled these off my shelf and this is how they are appearing in this video. But sticking with Reconstruction history, Manisha Sinha, and I have another one of her books. This one's called The Slave's Cause, but this one is The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic. This one's really cool because she expands the narrative of what is typically included in Reconstruction history, like westward expansion, and she talks about the Chinese exclusion. She has a chapter on women's rights activists, and just kind of bringing all of this into the Reconstruction conversation. She uses a massive, impressive list of primary materials to support this work, from letters and newspapers to Freedmen's Bureau documents and also congressional proceedings. So you're really getting a big variety of perspectives. It's not just a ground up or top down perspective. She really tries to bring in a variety of pieces here. And again, that section included in relation to women's history, that chapter is fascinating. Speaking of women's history, a historian that I encountered in this past summer 2025 was Rebecca DeWolf, and I read her work Gendered Citizenship: The Original Conflict Over the Equal Rights Amendment 1920 to 1963. I love this book. I cannot recommend it enough. If you are interested in women's history, the divisions that have occurred within women's history, not just a clean overview of how the equal rights came into existence and how that process has evolved over time, but really getting into the messy bits where there were disputes, disagreements. Sorry, I got to turn my notes. I highly recommend this book. The conflict over the initial ERA is one of my personal favorites. I have a video on that. That's what I was mentioning earlier. If you want to check it out before jumping into this, or maybe after. She divides the groups who were in dispute over the Equal Rights Amendment into protectionist and emancipationist. Now, this concept of dividing them is not wholly novel. She was building off of Joan Zimmerman's article, The Jurisprudence of Equality. which is a phenomenal article. But this presentation of the conflict and how it evolved over time was so fleshed out. Evolution of the protectionists specifically has stuck with me, and I still think about how we got from Florence Kelley and the pillar of women's activism and social services that she was, to then Phyllis Schlafly, and then where we are today. The next one is someone that many of you will be familiar with if you're interested in women's history, especially American history, and that is Linda Kerber. This is No Constitutional Right to Be Ladies. If you enjoy legal history, this is one for you. I love legal history. I'm completing a second master's degree right now, and my core focus is legal and constitutional history, but then I add a gendered lens to that, and that is how I came across Linda Kerber's work. I am guilty of not considering the history of jury service nearly enough. Because it is just such a common thing in 2026 for the most part. But I've been working on some research over the past almost year now on Bernita Shelton Matthews, and that led me here into looking at how Linda Kerber talked about the history and the evolution of women's access to jury service and having a jury of our peers. Also, the story of Gwendolyn Hoyt in Chapter 4 is a wild ride, so highly recommend anything by Linda Kerber. The next two I'm going to kind of talk about in conjunction. So the first one is Laboring Women by Jennifer L. Morgan. About 2 years ago, I came to the conclusion that my thesis for this degree was going to focus on Lydia Mariah Child. And there is a letter that many of you are probably familiar with if you are into gender and American history, especially early American history, and that was Lydia Mariah Child's response to Governor Wise after John Brown was arrested. She's so sassy. It's fantastic. But there was a section of that letter in which she's not technically responding to Governor Wise. She's responding to a woman who saw the letter that Governor Wise published. Wow. Anyway, anybody else watching The Gray House? As soon as I saw Governor Wise, I was like, ew. Anyway, back on topic. In this letter, she responds to this woman and she references partus sequitur ventrum. And she's talking about how babies from their mothers and forced into enslavement. And from there, I started looking into Jennifer Morgan's work, who is really probably one of the top historians, scholars who have written about that topic. I wondered, after I saw Lydia Mariah Child's work and then thinking about Morgan's, were abolitionists thinking about abolition and the enslaved experience from an intersectional lens? Because Lydia Mariah Child certainly was. It was not surprising to me that she was aware of this, but it does make me wonder how many other abolitionists were taking such an intersectional approach to talking about the enslaved experience and advocating for why that was wrong. So, Laboring Women, Jennifer L. Morgan, but she also in this book talks about daughters frequently inheriting enslaved persons, as they weren't inheriting property or the home or money in the same way that boys would have, or men, but they were inheriting enslaved people. And that leads me to Stephanie E. Jones Rogers and her book, They Were Her Property, where she really takes the stereotypical lens that enslavement was the men's work and just flips it on its head and really pulls in how women were complicit in this system and often had much more of a say-so, an impact on it than they are credited with. So absolutely love both Jennifer L. Morgan's Laboring Women and Jones Rogers, They Were Her Property. All right, 2 more to go. So this next one, I told you these weren't in any kind of order. I should have themed these, but the next one is called The Sentimental State, and it's by historian Elizabeth Garner Masaryk. Again, this goes back to my interest in Florence Kelley and social services and that history. Elizabeth Garner Masaryk bridges my interest in legal, labor, and gender history from the late 19th century so beautifully in this book. She tells this story through some of my favorite women, again, like Florence Kelley, Jane Addams of Hull House, and also Julia Lathrop, who headed the U.S. Children's Bureau when it first started. She tells that story, but she also talks about the Shepherd-Towner Act and how that came to be and the impact and precedent that that act set. So if you also have an interest in how women have been essential to reform, especially from the lens of social services, I highly recommend The Sentimental State. Last one is Joan Wallach Scott. I saved one of the first influential historians in my life for last. So my bachelor's in history, my undergraduate thesis focused on Muslim women's experiences under French colonization. And Joan Wallach Scott is an American historian of French history, and she has written significantly on the topic, and she inspired my undergraduate history thesis. This is less of a what you would consider necessarily a history, but more looking at the consequences and the ripple effects of history and how Muslim women, specifically in France, are still experiencing some of those ripple effects of colonization. So highly recommend. It's very readable, and Joan Wallach Scott is phenomenal, especially if you're interested in French history. Okay, that is it for this video. I hope you heard of at least one new book, one new woman historian that will interest you, and I will see you in the next one in a video all about women's history. Thanks for watching. Bye.